I, Purnima, welcome you to my class, and we are going to continue the last part of Triumph of Surgery. Now, I already told you that this lesson is written by James Harriet. Okay, he was the veterinary surgeon and he was born on 3rd October 1916 in Sunderland, England. Now, he was a noted veterinary doctor, and with whatever he is writing with the help of his vast experience. And this story is not imagination; it is a fact. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey was there, and she was having a pet dog. Okay, and what was the name of the dog? Tricky. Now, she used to love that dog very much, and she used to give a lot of food to eat to him. Now, one day the dog was not able to get up, and he started vomiting also. Mrs. Pumphrey has to call the veterinary doctor, Mr. Harriet. When doctor looked at the dog, he was very much worried. The doctor, James Harriet, is really worried. Tricky had become very fat. He looks like a bloated sausage. His eyes are red and rheumy. Mrs. Pumphrey is the mistress of the dog. She has given him malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks every night, but nothing works. Now, James Harriet advises Mrs. Pumphrey. James Harriet realizes that Tricky's only fault was greed for food. Dr. James Harriet advises Mrs. Pumphrey that she must cut Tricky food right down. She must give the dog some exercise. She must keep him on a very strict diet, otherwise he will fall ill. Tricky fall ill, but unfortunately, Tricky he falls ill. There is a doctor received a call from Mrs. Harriet. She tells him that Tricky doesn't eat and has a bouts of vomiting. He only lies down on rug painting. The doctor advises her that Tricky needs to be hospitalized for a fortnight. He is to be kept under observation. Tricky at hospital. At the surgery, the household dog search around Tricky. He sees them lying motionless. A bed for Tricky is made in a warm, loose box. For 2 days, no food is given to him but plenty of water. On the second day, he starts taking some interest in his surroundings. On the third day, he begins to whimper. When he hears a dog in the yard, Tricky starts taking a walk around the bowls, looking casually inside one or two of them. Well, Dr. Harriet, he advises her that he should be hospitalized under his observation. Finally, Tricky was he was hospitalized, and but children, there is a rapid progress. Though the doctor does not give him any medical treatment of any kind, he runs about the dog, joining their friendly barking. He starts fighting for his share of food, and he used to take enjoyments when he used to run after the rat at night. Dr. Harriet tells Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky is not in danger and recovering rapidly. Mrs. Pumphrey starts bringing eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up his strength. Wine and brandy are given to improve Tricky's constitution. The doctor informed that Tricky has recovered and Mrs. Pumphrey can collect him. Grateful Mrs. Pumphrey. Within 2 weeks, Tricky has been transformed into a flexible, hard-muscled animal. He is stretching out in great bounds when Tricky sees his mistress. He leaps and sails into her lap. As the car moves away, Mrs. Pumphrey leans out of the window. Her lips tremble and tears shine in her eyes. She says, "Oh, Mr. Harriet, how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." Okay, so Mrs. Pumphrey, finally she thanked Dr. Harriet. Her eyes were wet and lips tremble, and what she called Tricky recovery, a triumph of surgery. So this is all. Now children, today I am going to discuss with you textual question answer and some extra question answer. Okay. Though this lesson is very nice, and I would like to tell you the theme of the story. What is the theme of the story? The story, A Triumph of Surgery, revolves around an ill dog named Tricky and his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. The dog was hugely fat, his eyes were blood red and rheumy. Mrs. Pumphrey gave her malt, cod liver oil, and bowl of Horlicks. Still, Tricky had no energy. The doctor advised her to cut down on sweet things. Tricky left eating and kept vomiting. He was to be hospitalized. The doctor gave Tricky nothing to eat for first 2 days except water. On the third day there were signs of improvement. He started taking food properly. The doctor did not give him any medical treatment. Tricky used to run round and play with the other dogs cheerfully. Soon he recovered completely. Mrs. Pumphrey continued inquiring about Tricky on phone. When she came to collect the dog, tears were shining in her eyes. She called this magical recovery a triumph of surgery. Okay, so this is there. Now, I would like to discuss the question answer with you people. Okay, we have already discussed the main point of the story in both the videos, and it must be very clear to you. Now, textual question. We'll start with the textual question. So, why is Mrs. Pumphrey worried about Tricky? Mrs. Pumphrey, the mistress of Tricky, is really worried about her dog. He has grown quite fat and listless. What is the meaning of listless? Lifeless. Okay. Now, he has lost his appetite. He often vomits and lies down motionless on the carpet. So, children, he used to lie down motionless on the carpet. His eyes have become blood red and rheumy, and naturally tricky condition is a cause of deep concern for Mrs. Pumphrey. Now, question number 2. What does she do to help him? Is she wise in this? So, being the mistress of Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey is naturally worried about the condition of the dog. She at once called Dr. Harrier, telling him that Tricky has lost his appetite and is constantly vomiting. Though she goes on overfeeding the dog, her action is quite natural and expected. After all, Dr. Harriet is a famous veterinary surgeon and the dog is in his safe hands. Who does I refer to in this story? I refer to Dr. James Harriet, a famous veterinary surgeon. So, question, read and find out. This is from page number 3 of your lesson. No, is the narrator as rich as Tricky mistress? No, the famous surgeon doesn't seem to be as rich as Tricky mistress. How does he treat the dog? Dr. Harriet realizes that the only fault of Tricky is his greed for food. He simply can't refuse any food. Dr. Harriet keeps the dog under his own observation. He doesn't give him any medicine. For 2 days, he gave no food to him except plenty of water. After 3 days, Tricky started developing signs of recovery. Within a fortnight, a dog is completely cured and handed over to his mistress. Why is he tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? Dr. James Harriet is tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. Mrs. Pumphrey, the mistress of Tricky, is quite a rich lady and resourceful. She is a resourceful woman. The days he spends in treating Tricky are days of deep content. She sends all delicacies and drinks for breakfast. Fresh eggs, wine, and brandy are served quite liberally. Naturally, it is temptation to keep Tricky as a permanent guest. Why does Mrs. Pumphrey think the dog recovery is a triumph of surgery? This is a very important question, children. I feel this is the main part of the question, that why the name of the lesson is also a triumph of surgery. So Tricky is in a miserable condition. He has become hugely fat, loses his appetite, vomits quite often, and lays motionless, panting on the carpet. Saving such a dog is nothing less than a miracle for the mistress of Tricky. Naturally, she gratefully thanks the doctor and calls his feat a triumph of surgery. What kind of a person do you think? Now, children, I am going to do the question answer of page number 6. So, what kind of person do you think the narrator, a veterinary surgeon, is? Would you say he is tactful as well as full of common sense? Dr. James Harriet is a famous veterinary surgeon. He is very sensible, practical, but genuinely concerned about Ricky. He is really worried at his miserable condition. He is tactful as well as full of common sense. He does not give him any medical treatment. He knows that the only fault of Ricky is his greed for food. So he gives him no food but plenty of water, and his tactfulness and common sense help him in curing the dog. Now, question number 2 of page number 6. Do you think Tricky was happy to go home? What do you think will happen now? Well, Tricky was completely cured. He was now a totally transformed animal. He was flexible and hard muscle. Naturally, he was happy to go home. The moment he saw his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, he took a tremendous leap and sailed into her lap. Now he would run around the garden, joining the friendly barking of his fellow dogs. Do you think he is a real life episode or more mere fiction, or is it a mixture of both? The story, A Triumph of Surgery, seems to be a real life episode. It doesn't look like merely a fictional episode. There are such rich ladies like Mrs. Pumphrey who are so much devoted to their pet dogs. They pamper their pet dogs by overfeeding them and not giving them enough or necessary exercise. However, pampering Tricky with fresh egg, wine and brandy seems rather a little exaggerated and even silly on this chapter. So now I would also like to tell you the difference between fact and fiction. Fiction, children, whatever things we imagine is a fiction, and fact we all know is a truth. So this story is based on this doctor experience, Mr. James Harriet experience. This is a fact. Now some question is there on page number 7. So I'm going to discuss those question answers also. This episode describes the silly behavior of a rich woman who is foolishly indulgent, perhaps because she is lonely. Do you think such people are merely silly, or can their actions cause harm to others? Mrs. Pumphrey seems to be a lonely woman. It is quite natural that she should keep a pet dog. She treats Tricky as a mother treats her child, but her overindulgence looks silly and exaggerated. Her silly overindulgence hurts the dog. His greed for food and Mrs. Pumphrey's liberal surprise of delicacies make him hugely fat. He loses appetite and finally he started vomiting. So just because her extreme love, she does not even care for her health. So she is merely a silly lady. Now question number 2, do you think there are also parents like Mrs. Pumphrey? Yes, there are parents like Mrs. Pumphrey. There is no dearth of indulgent parents who pamper their children. Their silly and overindulgent behavior spoils their children in the same way as Mrs. Pumphrey pampered Tricky. This indulgence and pampering only makes children obese and dull. Now, question number 3. What would you have done if you were a member of the staff in Mrs. Pumphrey's household? A neighbor, what would your life have been like in general? So in this question you have to think, and I think individually it could be children, it could varies. But if I had been a member of the staff in Mrs. Pumphrey household, I would have suggested her the same thing as it was done by Dr. Harriet. I would have suggested her cutting down Tricky's diet and give him some exercise. Being a neighbor of such an over-indulgent and silly woman would not have been very easy and comfortable. Perhaps she and her pampered dog would have been a nuisance. Now the last question of page number 7. What would you have done if you were in the narrator's place? If I had been in the narrator's place, I would have behaved in the same way as he had done. I would have realized soon that Tricky's main fault had been his greed for food. Not giving him any solid food for a few days and giving him plenty of exercise would have brought him in proper shape. I would have thus transformed him into a flexible and hard-muscled dog. So children, these were the textual questions. Now I would love to describe some additional questions, both long and short questions. Now, why was Dr. Harriet really worried about Tricky? This is the question number 1. So when Dr. Harriet saw Tricky with his mistress, he was really worried. He was shocked at his appearance. The dog was usually fat. He loves appetites and he vomits quite often. Do you think there are also parents? So children, why was Dr. Harriet really worried about Tricky? When Dr. Harriet saw Tricky with his mistress, he was really worried. He was shocked at his appearance. The dog had been hugely fat. His eyes were bloodshot and rheumy. His tongue lolled from his jaws. Naturally, the miserable condition of the dog made him really worried. What special diet did Mrs. Pumphrey give to build Tricky up? Mrs. Pumphrey found that Tricky had become listless. He seems to have no energy. She thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. She decided to give some little special diet between meals to build him up. She gave him some malt, cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night. She could not refuse cakes and chocolates to Tricky even after being advised by the doctor to cut down all these sweet things. She did not listen. What was the only fault of Tricky as diagnosed by Dr. Harriet? Dr. Harriet knew that overindulgence and pampering of Tricky's mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, created problem for him. The only fault of Tricky was his greed for food. He had never known to refuse food. Overfeeding and not giving him proper exercise made him hugely fat and dull. Now the next question is, why did Dr. Harriet try to sound severe when he gave strict instruction to Mrs. Pumphrey about Tricky? So the answer is, Dr. Harriet knew the real cause of Tricky's problem. He found that the only fault of Tricky was his greed for food. So he gave strict instruction to Tricky's mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. He asked her to cut his food right down. He also recommended giving him more exercise and keeping him on a very strict diet. What plan did Dr. Harriet make to get Tricky out of the house? Dr. James Harriet realized that as long as Tricky was with Pumphrey, he would be miserable. He suggested her that Tricky must be hospitalized for a fortnight. He would be under his observation. The lady almost fainted on hearing this, but Dr. James Harriet took a firm line. He insisted that the dog was ill and it was the only way of saving him. How did Mrs. Pumphrey react when she heard from the doctor that Tricky needed to be hospitalized for a fortnight? Mrs. Pumphrey. When Dr. Harriet informed Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky was to be kept under his supervision, Mrs. Pumphrey almost fainted on hearing this. It was extremely difficult for her to be away from her pampered pet for a fortnight. She agreed only after Dr. Harriet told her that was the only way of saving Tricky. Now, how was Tricky treated at the surgery? Dr. Harriet gave no medical treatment to Tricky. He realized that the only problem of Tricky was his greed for food. For 2 days, he kept an eye on him. He gave him no food but plenty of water. He made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to where other dogs slept. Describe the gradual progress of Tricky at the surgery. Tricky's main problem was his greed for food. For 2 days, Dr. Harriet gave no food but plenty of water to the dog. On the first day, Tricky lay motionless on the carpet. On the second day, he started showing some interest in his surroundings. On the third day, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. From then on, his progress was rapid. Rapid means quick or fast. He started for his share of food and hunting rats at night. How did the word convulsing affect Tricky's Mr. Mrs. Pumphrey? I told you the meaning of this word. The moment Mrs. Pumphrey heard that Tricky was out of danger and convulsing, she was excited. She started bringing fresh egg, 2 dozen fresh egg, 2 dozen at a time to build up his strength. Wine and brandy were given to enrich Tricky's blood. For a few nights, brandy was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. Why was Dr. Harriet tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? Dr. Harriet wasn't keeping Tricky in his surgery as a permanent guest because Mrs. Pumphrey was an overindulgent lady. For a happy period, Dr. Harriet and his partner had 2 eggs each for breakfast. Whatever she was sending him for Tricky, Dr. Harriet and his partner, they were using it like 2 eggs each for breakfast. Then there was a liberal inflow of wine and brandy. There were days of deep content for him. He was naturally tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. Now, what excuses did Mrs. Pumphrey give for not following Dr. Harriet's advice? What was the effect of the ignorance? Dr. Harriet knew that the only fault of Tricky was his greed for food. Mrs. Pumphrey was an indulgent mistress and pampered Tricky with malt, cod liver oil, and bowls of Horlicks. Dr. Harriet had advised her to cut down on sweets and give him some exercise. Tricky was to be kept on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey told the doctor that it was very difficult. The result of ignoring the doctor's advice was disastrous. Tricky lost his appetite and lay motionless on the carpet. He vomited again and again. Why did Tricky become an uninteresting object for other dogs at the surgery? Tricky was to be hospitalized for a fortnight. The pathetic little dog was gasping for breath. At the surgery, the household dogs searched around Dr. Harriet. Tricky looked down at the noisy dog with dull eyes helplessly. He lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs circled around him, sniffing for a few seconds. They decided that the Tricky was an uninteresting object for them, therefore they ignored. How did Mrs. Pumphrey and her servant behave when Tricky was being taken away to the surgery? Dr. Harriet had advised that Tricky must be hospitalized under his observation for a fortnight. What do you mean by fortnight? Fortnight means, fortnight means that for 15 days. When the dog was being sent away to the surgery, the whole staff was roused. The maid rushed in and out. They were busy in bringing Tricky day's bed. night bed, cushion, toys, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, etc. When he was departing, everybody was in tears. The overindulgent Mr. and Mrs. Pumphrey gave a cry in desperation. Wow was Tricky accepted as a member of the game and the other dogs started enjoying his company. Tricky was out of danger. He started taking interest in his surrounding. On the other third day, Joe, the greyhound, and other dogs surrounded him. They rolled him over and inspected him. Tricky followed them to the garden. He was running and rolling down in their company. Now he was accepted as a member of their game. Do you think that Mr. Harriet was a sensible, practical, and clever person? How? Yes, Dr. Harriet was a pragmatic person. He was sensible enough to recognize Tricky greed for food. He was highly practical. He knew that it was difficult for Mrs. Pumphrey to part with the dog, so he advised her that Tricky must be hospitalized under his supervision for a fortnight. It was necessary to save him. He was a clever person and was tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. Actually, he was enjoying best of both the worlds. Wasn't Mrs. Pumphrey an overindulgent but silly and impractical mistress? Yes, Mrs. Pumphrey was rich, fabulously rich. She could afford to be overindulgent towards her favorite pet dog, Tricky. The dog was pampered like a spoiled child. She was silly enough to provide cushion, toys, day bed, night bed, unnecessary items like malt, cod liver, oil, Horlicks, wine and brandy which are not available even to human beings. Her impractical nature led to overfeeding of Tricky. He grew hugely fat, listless and dull. Now children, I am going to discuss few a long question with you. Now children, the rules for long question, at least 2 to 3 paragraphs should be there. 2 to 3 paragraphs should be there. And children, no scribbling, nothing like that should be there. Okay. So my first question. Is about character sketch. Okay. So give a brief character sketch of Mrs. Pumphrey. Now children, whenever we discuss character sketch, we have to give positive point first and then negative points afterwards. Okay, like Mrs. Pumphrey was, and then you have to give a lot of example from the chapter itself. So Mrs. Pumphrey was a fabulous, rich and resourceful lady with a large number of servants and maids. She was passionately attached to her little pet dog, Tricky. She was much worried about Tricky's miserable condition. Tricky had become hugely fat and listless. She thought he was suffering from malnutrition. So she started giving Tricky malt, cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night. Being overindulgent, Mrs. Pumphrey even ignored Dr. Harriet's advice. The doctor knew that Tricky's only fault was his greed for food. He had advised Mrs. Pumphrey to cut down food and sweet for Tricky. He also advised her to give him plenty of exercise. The dog was to be kept on a very strict diet. For Mrs. Pumphrey, it was very difficult for her because she pampered Tricky like a spoiled child. The only compounded Tricky misery. His condition worsened. He lost appetite and he started vomiting. Mrs. Pumphrey was very impractical lady. Now children, we can give negative points afterwards. Okay, so she was very impractical lady, very compassionate and caring. She and her staff arranged all comfortable beds, cushions and toys for Tricky. She consulted, inquired about his health from Dr. Harriet. She gratefully thanked Dr. Harriet for saving Tricky's life and called it a triumph of surgery. Had she been a little more practical and disciplined, things might have not gone that far. Okay, so children, this is all about now what we will say about character sketch of Tricky. Tricky was definitely more than a dog. Actually, he was like a pampered child. Okay, so he was like a pampered child, we can say, and he was a small dog and very affectionate. Okay, but because children, very few positive character is there of a dog, but you can say, we can say children, but he had a pamper, he had a liking for food. His greed for food made him ill. He became rheumy and restless. He became fat. His tongue lolled from his jaws. The doctor advises Mrs. Pumphrey to keep Tricky on a very strict diet and give him plenty of exercise. Tricky became a victim of overindulgence and overfeeding. Dr. Harrier's instructions were ignored. Tricky lost appetite and started vomiting. Dr. Harrier suggested Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky be hospitalized under his observation for a fortnight. Tricky was so much attached to her that she almost fainted merely at the thought of his separation. Tricky was highly pampered. The entire staff were ever ready to pamper him with bed, cushions, toys. Tricky recovery was rapid, quick, and children um, anyway, but he had shown love for his mistress. At the last, when she saw him, she came to pick him. He jumped into her lap. So, children, this in this way we can write the characteristic of a person or an animal. And with this, I end my video here. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.